Okay, why don't we get started? So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's literary Zoom lecture brought to you by Wilton Library. I'm Michael Bellicosa, Community Engagement Manager here at the library, and I'm very pleased to be introducing this lecture, which is made possible with the support of the literary series in memory of Amy Quigley. You've all heard this before, but because we have a large audience, we're going to handle the Q&A at the end of the program. And we'll do it by you using the Q&A button to send me a question or a comment, and I'll relay them to Mark after his lecture. And by the way, Mark is always happy to answer questions that you can email him directly later. And if you haven't done so already, feel free. And if you need his email address, just let me know and I'll send it along. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark for our fourth and final lecture, but we're already working on another series for some time in the either very late winter or spring.
Thanks, Michael. And once again, thank you to everyone for coming out or staying home, wherever you're Zooming. This is, yes, the fourth and final. And with that in mind, I hope to say some comments to sort of wrap up the series, even as I talk about Graham Greene and this novel that I very much admire. It's the latest of our books. We should keep that in mind. So we're more than 30 years past The Secret Agent. And one thing to keep in mind when you read Graham Greene, who began his novel writing career in 1932, he published dozens of novels, 4 travel books, several collections of short stories, 6 plays, 2 books of autobiography, and 4 books for children, in addition to be a movie reviewer. Many of his novels were made into movies, and one movie based on his script, The Third Man, was written as a film treatment first and then made into a novel. He wrote the novel version of his own movie after the movie was screened. Really quite a remarkable man. As I mentioned earlier in the series, one of the issues in this period is the problem of evil, embraced by some writers like Conrad and Greene, but largely avoided, in the opinion especially of Graham Greene, by writers like Lawrence and Woolf and Foster. In addition, I've emphasized the modernist movement's intense interest in the value of the primitive. And if you were going to take one thing away from this series of lectures, I hope it would be that, to keep in mind how much the modernist writers, critics, and intellectuals were despairing of what was called progress and worried that the advancement of the technological, sociological, national status of the world was getting people away from what was primitive and fundamental. You will have an insight into a lot of the movement to the basic, including the elemental evil that's represented by Pinky in this novel. Unlike somebody like Woolf, since we're turning from her to Graham Greene, Graham Greene is celebrated for having an equal attention to environment and consciousness. He felt that Virginia Woolf was so suffused with an interest in consciousness, the interior life, which he recognized was a needed corrective to the novel, that she lost respect or interest in the world of actual relations and people. He felt strongly that fictional language should not call attention to itself, which he felt was what Woolf was guilty of, and that it should give a true picture of the world through a lucid kind of prose. He was fascinated by the problem of evil, which was not a consequence, but more likely a reason for his conversion to Christianity, to Catholicism rather. And it's reported that Evil and War, another writer, English writer, born around the same time as Greene, he did not live quite so long as Graham Greene's 87 years. Evil and War, another convert to Catholicism, apparently or reportedly said to Graham Greene, you know, Graham, you've made more money out of the devil than I've made out of God. Graham Greene was interested in writing what he called thrillers, sensational novels, and this was begun as a thriller novel, that is a crime novel. He distinguished in his career, at least in the beginning, between entertainments, novels that he wrote for people to enjoy as thrillers or crime novels, and his serious fiction. He later on erased that distinction, but one reason it's important to keep the date of 1938 in our head is that he has to do something that Virginia Woolf largely did not, and that is he's competing with the cinema. Readers of fiction in England in the 1930s are intensely aware that there is now another arena of entertainment for thrillers, for crime fiction, for the entertainment that he wrote when he was writing novels that he did not think were necessarily as literarily sophisticated as others. And so that's worth keeping in mind. In the same way, movies change in the late 50s when they have to compete with television. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Graham Greene, this novel, and try to give a nod towards the other books we've talked about and a kind of summing up this evening. So his relationship with modernism is complicated since he shares some techniques with other fiction writers we've been considering, as I'll discuss, but his themes are very different. It's worth noting that he's a late modernist, and not just because he's the only one of our authors who was born in the 20th century. One of his chief criticisms of fellow modernists is this failure to acknowledge the existence or nature of evil. He converted to Catholicism in 1926 at the age of 22 after meeting his future wife, herself a convert to Catholicism. And he agreed to be educated about that religion because he said, quote, he ought to at least learn the nature and limits of the beliefs she held. Their marriage produced 2 children, although he left the family in 1947, saying that a writer, he said of himself that he had a character profoundly antagonistic to ordinary domestic life. So he left with that statement. The 2 of them never divorced. The marriage remained in force until his death in 1991. That may be a function of their both being Catholics, or maybe for other reasons. One never knows about marriages. He chafed at the label Catholic novelist, preferring to be thought of as a novelist who is Catholic. Later in his life, he referred to himself as a Catholic agnostic or even a Catholic atheist. So I will say there's a little bit of disingenuousness when he complains about being pigeonholed as a Catholic novelist, because in fact, he referred to some of his novels as having Catholic themes. This one, and certainly The End of the Affair, which is more explicitly about Catholicism and a Catholic God. So there are pessimistic, dark writers earlier in the period. The work of the English writers A.E. Housman, who's 1859 to 1936, and Thomas Hardy, 1840 to 1928. Those works engage with human reaction, pessimism, stoicism to a world of hardship and difficulty. But their work is less interested in the source or nature of the negativity and more concerned with how people react to it. Conrad's turn of the century Heart of Darkness does reflect a recognition of the horror of something savage in human nature, some secret agency, and I'm using that word intentionally, that is in human beings. But that recognition in that novella is framed in existential terms that remain abstract and even vague. And it's worth noting that the horror that is at the heart of darkness, the horror, a phrase that is said in the novel by Kurtz as his last words, is avoided in repetition when Marlowe, the narrator, is asked by the betrothed, the beloved, what Kurtz's last words are, and was employed as a quotation in works by T.S. Eliot. It's worth noticing that horror is one of the last words in this novel as well. And with Halloween nearly upon us, it's worth remembering how horrific the word horror is. With respect to Howard's End, I'm doing a little survey of evil in our period, which is all the way back to 1910. The Wilcoxes are emphatically associated with callousness and careless destruction and unethical behavior. But except for the important reference to panic and emptiness that is heard in Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it's sympathy rather than judgment that is mainly expressed in that novel for the enactment of the failures of the Wilcoxes. The father of the family is forgiven, and the sense is of a resolution rather than any kind of condemnation. In Mrs. Dalloway, there's the dangerousness of living and the aftermath of the Great War, as I have discussed. But as with Howard's End, the emphasis is on personal relations and the need to connect rather than wider issues of human weakness. And that's also a novel of resolution. Clarissa solves the problem, if we want to call it that, of what to make of Septimus's sacrifice and suicide when she learns of it at her party. And the novel resolves the multiplicity of Clarissa when it establishes her in the last line of the novel, for there she was. Returning from those novels to Brighton Rock is a different matter entirely. And I hope you found that to be true. One can never predict what someone's reaction to books will be in terms of liking or admiring or disliking or disparaging. And luckily, I don't concern myself with that. And you don't have to concern yourself with whether I concern myself with that. But I am, of course, interested in your seeing the book in the context of culture, which is what this series and most of my teaching is about. Brighton Rock is an entirely different matter. It opens as a thriller. Hale knew before he had been in Brighton 3 hours that they meant to murder him. So there's a chase in the beginning of the novel that is reversed by the end when the hunters become the hunted. And that's a classic formula for a comedy. When I mean comedy here, I don't mean ha-ha comedy. I mean comedy in the sense that things have gone wrong and they get set right. So the going out is balanced by the coming back in something like the Iliad and the Odyssey, where you can see finally that the Odyssey is a comic work of coming home, of resolution and reunion that offsets the tragedy of war. So I'm talking not about comedy in the laugh out loud sense. No one's waiting for Brighton Rock, the musical, right? I mean, a very, very grim book. One of the darkest endings in all of literature, I think, and I don't mean that as an overstatement. So that reversal, first evil chasing a more or less innocent man, and then the reversal of that pattern begins in the very opening pages of the novel, which ends not as a thriller, but on a note of existential devastation as Rose walks home in the hope that Pinky's recording of the message that he loved her will, as the priest told her, show that there was some good in him. And the issue of whether it's possible for a deeply sinful and even evil person to be redeemed is mentioned obliquely in the novel more than once. The reference to between the stirrup and the ground is a reference to a saying that the mercy of God is so powerful, the extraordinary mercy of God is so powerful that redemption can be found between the stirrup and the ground. That is, between the few seconds of being knocked off your horse and hitting the ground in death. and the old joke about St. Augustine, who lived a very desolate life, but had the sense to get his life together and became a saint. The old joke about that is, dear God, please let me be reformed, but not for a few years yet, right? If it's true that I can be bad for a while, for a good long while, and be redeemed at the end, let's work on that timing. Well, there's no humor of that kind or any kind much in this book. That devastation that she's waiting for, we know exactly what is awaiting her, what the narrator calls in the last phrase of the novel, the worst horror of all. And if you think of this in terms of the drama, we know what he said. We know that she's not only going to learn of it, say second or third hand, she's going to hear his voice say it in a recording that would not have been possible, say, 50 years before in the Victorian age. Another aspect of the modern elements of this modernist book is that she gets to hear it in his voice, his cursing her, essentially. And the child that she imagines she will play the record for. This novel was made into at least two movies, one in 1947 with a very young Richard Attenborough playing Pinky, who was released in America as young Scarface, trying to pick up the notion that it was really a gangster movie, and made again in 2010, where the time frame of the novel was moved up to the 1960s, and the gang were punks versus mods. If you don't know what that is, you can be forgiven. But the time frame was brought up to the 1960s. And in the movie version of 1947, Rose is in a care facility or a kind of a boarding house, and she borrows, without asking for, a phonograph so she can play her record while the woman who owns that is asleep. And you watch with bated breath because you think you're going to hear her hear the record. And there's a flaw in the record, or maybe a dysfunction in the phonograph, and so she can't hear it. And so it comes close to revealing it, but we know that it's somewhere in her future. So the world, the flesh, and the devil are, in Catholic theology, the enemies of the soul. That's the sort of anti-trinity of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Ida believes in the world. The word stranger means nothing to Ida. Quote, there was no place in the world where she felt like a stranger. We're told that she remarks to no one in particular, it's a good life. Earlier in the novel, when she commits herself to her mission to find out what happened to Hale, she comments that it's going to be exciting, it's going to be fun, it's going to be a bit of life. All great literature, no matter how dark it may seem, is always on the side of life, always. It may be that its view of life differs radically from ours, but always on the side of life. That may seem like an extreme statement, but it's partly tautological. If it's not on the side of life, it doesn't really rise to great literature. The narrator in this book adds that in saying this, Ida gives the highest praise she could give to anything that is exciting, fun, and a bit of life. And think of how the fun, excitement, bit of life is really, in a different register, what animates Clarissa Dalloway. Part of the joy of giving that party, of being involved in plunging into experience, is that kind of fun, that kind of joy. It's certainly something that the Schlegel sisters have, and it's something that is invoked at the end of Howard's End when they're celebrating the summer and the joy of that landscape and the conquest of allergies when the hay is going to rise greater than ever, again, on the side of life. And you don't see, of course, that sense of playfulness of anything approaching joy in The Secret Agent, as an example. So the highest praise you could give to anything is excitement, fun, going to be a bit of life. Peaky Brown, a Roman Catholic, believes in hell, invokes flames and damnation and torments, because he explains to Rose Wilson, it's the only thing that fits. It's the only way he can make sense of his world, the damnation. If you read the book, you have a very good sense of his background and why that would be true, even at the young age of 17. As to heaven, the best he can say is maybe. He says he believes in Satan and states credo in unum santanum. So using the Latin to say that he believes in one Satan, not one God, but one Satan. So even his defiance of a Catholic God is said in Catholic terms, that is Latin. So he is as deeply religious, just in an opposite direction, as someone who's a person of faith. George Santayana, the writer and historian, said that there is such a thing as a Catholic atheist, the phrase that I mentioned a few minutes ago, Graham Greene, late in his life, applied to himself. And George Santayana had in mind James Joyce. He said that a Catholic atheist is someone who believes that there is no God and that Mary is his mother. That is witty, by which I mean both funny and wise, because it recognizes that for such a person who is like Joyce, suffused in the Roman Catholicism of his childhood and his nation, it's not possible to have your unbelief not be suffused with that Catholicism. You disbelieve in a Catholic kind of way. So heaven and hell do not engage Ida at all, who affirms, I believe, in right and wrong. That is, in the oppositions not of the supernatural world, but the world of human relations. She has no interest in confession, repentance. I'm quoting partly in places, but I won't stop to tell you where they come from. Because, as she tells Rose, that's just religion. That is, confession, repentance is just the furniture of religion. Believe me, she says in book 7, it's the world we've got to deal with. Ida, who in Rose's view doesn't know what a mortal sin is, loves life and this world. You can tell, she says, that the world is all dandy with her. And again, that language is the tone of the narrator's admiration for Ida as a kind of force of life. You will look in vain to find the word dandy in The Secret Agent, and you might not be able to find it anywhere in Conrad. So I've talked about the world and the devil, but it's, of course, the theme of the flesh that most brings out the differences between the opposing characters of Pinky and Ida. That is sex, but of course, in the religious way, you can avoid using the word sex by using flesh. It reminds me that in Tom Stoppard's great play Arcadia, the pre-sexual, pre-adolescent girl who is at the center of that play is reading the Latin, and she translates what Antony and Cleopatra did as a carnal embrace. And her tutor wants to avoid having to engage her on the issue of sexuality. So he tries to get her to believe that they're hugging meat. They're hugging meat. It didn't take. So theme of flesh. Very opening pages, we encounter these two very opposite characters. The cruel and twisted 17-year-old boy with a face of starved intensity. So he's undernourished. His perversion is partly a matter of deficiency, of isolation but also there's a better word that's not coming to me, deprivation. He's not just depraved, he's deprived. And I'm not punning. That's the way he's seen. Him on the one side, and the friendly, big-bodied, 40-something woman who makes one think, says the narrator, of sucking babies when you looked at her. What a fantastic phrase. And even if you take that to mean that it's because she is full-bosomed, what an elegant way of saying that she makes you think of life. It could have been sexual, it could have been lustful, it could have been lewd, the comment. Makes you think of sucking babies when you looked at her. No, not only is on the same, that she's on the side of life, but that description is on the same page as a face of starved intensity when talking about Pinky. So Pinky, who is not sanguine, not ruddy, not robust, is described as starving on the same page in which Ida is described as making you think of sucking babies when you looked at her. That's the brilliance of Graham Greene. And that kind of poetic insight, expression is everywhere in the novel, but it doesn't call attention to itself because it doesn't seem like an impressionistic novel. I'm a great fan of Virginia Woolf, but you are aware when you're reading Woolf that you're reading a novel, that you're reading an attempt to represent artistically the fleeting experiences of life. And this is true in the extreme when you read James Joyce's Ulysses and other works like that. You are not entering into a contract where you're forgetting that you're reading a book. But Brighton Rock, like a good movie, thriller, crime drama or thriller, depends upon you're not saying, oh, it's just a movie. Oh, it's just a movie. And so much of the great writing is hidden. And I think that's a perfect example, starved intensity and sucking babies. Having witnessed his parents' frighteningly weekly exercises every Saturday, we're told that Pinky has his virginity straightened in him like sex, as if his virginity was a kind of erection, and that his straightening is of his virginity, that is his stubbornness not to bend to normal human intimacy. In Joyce's Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, autobiographically infused fiction, Stephen Dedalus, a surrogate for James Joyce, decides that in order to be an artist, he can't just embrace the unilateral and incomplete beliefs of Catholicism, which have no room for normal human sexuality. And he decides, Stephen, as Joyce did, that he needs to experiment with what it is to be sexual and dissolute. And so he goes to a prostitute in the novel, as Joyce did more than once in his own life. And he found that when the prostitute said to him, "Bend down your head and kiss me," he would not bend. And that she has to try to force his head down for just a regular mouth-to-mouth kiss. And he's resistant. And he's resistant because his virginity is straightening in him like sex. That is, his distaste for sexuality because of his upbringing, because of his imagination, because he can't get out of his own way, has a kind of rigidity like a male erection. It's again, brilliant and consistent. By contrast, Ida tells Rose that sex is natural. It's like breathing. And that's in book 4. Pinky is disgusted by sex and by any sense of human intimacy. The narrator says of him, he was like a child with hemophilia. Every contact drew blood. Again, a breathtaking description of his absolute fragility, described in medical terms that completely render just how vulnerable he is. Again, his name is Pinky, but there's nothing pinkish about him. Ida is seen as craving and returning human contact. She has large, vivacious eyes, and her large breasts and easy sexuality are constantly invoked in the novel. A word that is used about her is accommodating. And it doesn't just mean in the sense of being sexually loose. She is friendly and open to other people. She's an accommodating person. Whereas Pinky thinks in terms of damnation and its related images, and in fact, he gets burned at the end by his own sulfuric acid before he falls to his death. Ida thinks in terms of right and wrong and is as obsessed with justice as Pinky is with hell. And of course, the sulfuric acid is not a piling on, and it's not unrealistic. It was very common to be used as a weapon that was disfiguring without killing you, and that was easy to get, unlike poisons or explosives or weapons. And it was very common in England and other places, including, unfortunately, in our own country in recent memory. Maybe all of you have heard at one time or another, an act where someone, often a male, uses sulfuric acid to quote unquote punish someone, often a female, with that weapon that you can buy because it's not a weapon and that you can be sure will maim, disfigure, and traumatize without running into murder charges. It's quite realistic. And yet in the novel, it also has the component that he's burned as if he were burned by the flowers of damnation. So Ida is as obsessed with justice as he is with hell. She says, I like fair play. And later on, she says, I never give in, an admirable quality. And she says, I'm like everyone else. I want justice. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you that she's not like everyone else. She's being modest. And I've lived long enough to know that not everyone wants justice. What most people want and what they call justice is what they want. They want what they want. But unlike many other people, Ida doesn't want justice for herself, but for others. She wants it for Hale. She wants it for Rose. And when we consider, and again, I'm trying to point out to you that Graham Greene's greatness lies in a modestly understated poetical language. You may not have noticed, or you may have, that the woman who marries pale, starved Pinky is named Rose, not just a flower, but a color. And that Hale, the man who's killed, means healthy. These are not accidents. And even if you think that they're accidents, which they may be, what I said is also true. For me to take the meaning that Hale means healthy, Rose means sanguine, right? The color of blood in your cheek, rosy cheeks, ruddy, and that health, that rosiness associates with Ida and opposes what we know of Pinky. Even if you were to say to me, do you think that's intended by Graham Greene? I am perfectly at peace in thinking he didn't intend it. But I am even more at peace to say, but that's what it means. Because what a novel means is the work of the reader and not of the author. And this novel and all of Graham Greene's novels are filled with that kind of poetic attention to language that is not self-advertising. You've got to look for it. The narrator says of her, you can't get around her. She stood there like a wall at the end of an alley, scrawled with the obscene chalk of an enemy. That's a great description. So it doesn't take a poet, it doesn't take a sophisticated novelist to come up with the notion that she stood there like a wall. That's a very common image. In fact, Stonewall Jackson got his nickname from the fact that he stood resolute, would not be stopped, like a wall, like a stone wall. But to put the wall at the end of an alley, scrawled with obscene chalk messages of an enemy, shows you that Ida is willing to give tit for tat and to be just as forceful just as fearsome as the Pinky that she's opposing. That image, with its wall at the end of an alley and obscene chalk messages, conveys the sense that Ida's mission is fierce, it's informal, and it's personal. She's no more a professional investigator than Verloc is a professional spy or agent. Her determined mission, give me just a second, I'm looking for something that I may not be able to find quickly. Yes, her determined mission will involve neither the police nor any kind of formal politeness of public examination. Is there a better example in this novel of how it fits in within the theme of the modernist choice of a small society over the broader public world than this exchange that happens in the third chapter of the first book? Molly Pink, another name worth noting, says to Ida, "You a woman detective?" which would be anomalous even in that day. And Ida Arnold says to Molly, "Oh no, I'm just a friend of his." That quiet statement is so revealing of what I've been talking about in the entire series about E.M. Forster's notion of it's the small society and not the great society that is going to be our salvation. So I'm pausing there with a good 20 minutes left, not because I don't have more to say, but because I want to respect that this is the last of a series of 4, and that in addition to questions or comments you may have about this novel this evening, you may also have questions about the series as a whole or other books. And as I told Michael, I am not overscheduled today. And so as far as I'm concerned, we can go to midnight. Don't worry, Michael, I don't mean that. So I'll turn it over to you, Michael, and hope that I've said enough to invite some comments from the people in the Zoom room. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Well, let's see if they're typing away. There's nothing in there yet, but with that prompting you just gave them, we'll see. I have a question, but it's a little bit like sneaking in a coming attraction. If you don't mind just going off.
You're the man behind the curtain. You can sneak in anything you want.
Well, I was just going to say, since we're working on an idea of sort of an analogous series, but in the spring using American writers and American novels, that how would you just, in broad brushes, compare the modernism concept as it was expressed in British novels of the first 30, 40 years and American novels?
Yeah, so again, I'm going to take you up on that I can be broad. A couple of differences between the American novels in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and the British novel is the First World War was a radically different experience in America to what it was in Europe. It's a little bit like, I'm a native New Yorker. I spent many hours of my life in and around the World Trade Center. My father-in-law was director of special operations at the Trade Center. He's a man still alive at 96 who loved those buildings before they were buildings. That is when they were being planned. And I know that 9/11, which was attack not on New York City, but on the whole country, and in some ways on the free world, was not something that was the private property of New Yorkers. But I also know that it was experienced on the East Coast in a way that it wasn't experienced in Omaha or San Diego. The Great War was an experience in the British consciousness that overwhelms any amount of that consciousness in America. America was in the war a lot less long. We were farther away. It was much more over there for Americans than for Brits. The soldiers who went into the muddy fields in France would come home on leave, back across the channel to England and go back again. It was like the intimacy of soldiers who could fight at Gettysburg in the Civil War and see people from the countryside on hilltops having picnics watching the battle. In America, the war mattered, but it wasn't part of the radical consciousness that we see in the culture and writings of the Brits. The other thing is that Britain does not have a sense of its own prehistory as a matter of frontier or borders. One of the defining characteristics of American literature and American studies is the idea of a frontier, that America was involved in the earliest, that civilization goes so far and not farther. And that at the other side of this divide is the woods where the witches live, if you're reading Hawthorne, or the wilderness of the far west, if you're reading James Fenimore Cooper or Mark Twain, and the notion, the psychological notion that America grew up with, we have an errand in the wilderness, it's to bring civilization to a raw land. There isn't that issue in the British consciousness, and those two things that I've just mentioned in broad strokes very much inform differences in the novels. It's also true that America in its novels, if the writers are willing, confronts the issue of slavery and race relations, which is very different from anything in the 20th century British novel.
Great, thanks, Mark. That was
not a bad answer for a question I wasn't expecting, Michael.
Well, you know, I got to throw a curveball once in a while. Okay, so here's a
World Series time. Throw away.
Couple of questions here. Greene, as a Catholic, seems to believe in evil, but does he also believe in salvation? Pinky suffers, but in the end is not saved. Isn't that more Calvinist than Catholic?
Yeah. So let me say that let's not mince words and don't say he seems to believe in evil. I will despair of the first half hour of my talking this evening if you can't believe me when I say he doesn't seem to believe in evil, he believes in evil. No, he believes in forgiveness also. So Catholics as well as Calvinists believe in damnation. It's certainly one of the strong aspects of the religion. I won't turn this into a theological discussion, but just because Pinky may not have been saved does not mean that the writer doesn't believe in salvation. He does believe, and he makes it clear in that conversation with the priest, and many of his books embrace the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God. This is what 2 pages before the end of the novel, the old man tells Rose. The appalling strangeness of the mercy of God, so that forgiveness is possible. The main difference between Calvinists, if you can find one, and Catholics is that Calvinists believe that the parsing out of salvation and damnation was done early on, and that God is merciful but not generous. And so his salvation is complete but not plenteous. So few people get saved. We can talk about why they would come up with that formula, but that's it. The numbers of the saved are very small. Catholicism has no such accounting that way. So he's very fascinated, really obsessed with the appalling strangeness of the mercy of God. How does it work? This is a lot darker than mysterious ways. But he's also fascinated that there can be creatures who are as wicked as Pinky, even though he makes a pretty good, pretty credible, psychological, sociological explanation of why this young man is so screwed up. You could imagine that Graham Greene would be quite good at doing one of those social work reports that tells the court, yes, he's a terrible young man, he's done awful things, but look at him in context and please don't throw him into the gutter heap of history. And he underscores that by having the evil of the 17-year-old live after him in that worst horror of all. I cannot be the only person who, in reading this novel for the first time, thinks, oh my Lord, what is Rose going home to? That's very powerful. So the fact that some people may not be able to be saved does not push this novel in the direction of Calvinism, in my view.
Great, thanks, Mark. Uh, okay, there must have been terrible foreboding in England in 1938 due to brewing political events. How was this tough novel received in England upon publication?
Yeah, I want to say that I don't have infinite time in these preparations. I wish I did. And so I try to think in terms of looking into the course and making connections between the other novels we've talked about or other works like those by Houseman or Joyce or Hardy that we might have talked about. And I try to have a kind of interior logic of the course. And I don't look at or remind myself, oh, how was this novel received? And I don't mean that to the person who asked that question in any disrespectful way. That's a very interesting way to think about literature. And in fact, there are distinguished literary scholars who study only that issue, that is the reception of books depending on the time and place. But I don't worry about not being able to do it despite the respect I have for the question, because that's an easy thing to find out on the internet. You can look up and find out quite easily what was the reception in England, what was the reception in India, what was the reception in America for Graham Greene's works generally, for Brighton Rock. You cannot look up what does Mark Schenker's course on these 4 novels teach us about the modernist novel. And that's not a brag or a lament, it's just a fact. I will say that readers were enthralled by the notion that many of Greene's novels, whether they were about the Foreign Service or Catholicism explicitly or implicitly, or whether like the Stamboul Train or The Third Man, they seem to be great crime detective thriller novels, that they all seem to be located in this place of mystery and darkness and alienated people in an exotic landscape, whether Vietnam or South Mexico or Africa. And reviewers started to use the term Greenland, one word with the extra E and Greene's last name, to describe the kind of novelistic universe of Graham Greene's fiction, even when the plots were wildly different and even sometimes when the tone was different. I tell my students, my undergraduate students, that one of the things they want to try to get a sense of if they want to be an English major is not just what are the plots of Dickens novels like, what is Dickens novelistic style like, but what is the weather like when you read a Dickens novel? What's the climate like? When you read Jane Austen, you have a very good sense that the atmosphere, as it were, of your reading that novel is radically different from reading a novel by Dickens, which is radically different from reading a novel by D.H. Lawrence. And that if my students can be attentive to that and try to put their finger on that, they'll discover things like tone and style and point of view and vocabulary. It is very true that the varied works by Graham Greene, mainly, not all of them, share this sense of this landscape of moral ambiguity, of the possibility of hope in a landscape where the opposite is also true. Remember that The Secret Agent ends with the obsessed professor going off into a world where the world of men are like pests, as if all of the world is blighted, because that's a very dark novel. This novel doesn't say that Rose is going back to a world that will now be alien to her because she's lost her love. It doesn't say that the world she's embracing is a dark and empty world. She's facing the worst horror of all because the one shred of hope she has to hold on to is about to be ripped from her heart. Very, very dark and very much a matter of Greenland. And so that's a long-winded way of saying that for readers who thought that there was another kind of devastation coming culturally, globally to the world. And certainly by 1938, people who were paying attention knew that things were not looking good in Europe. By the next year, the world is at war. They would have been either interested in novels that in their escapism were also very dark, or want to avoid such a thing and go see a movie musical, many of which Graham Greene also reviewed. You may know he has a kind of infamy for reviewing a movie with Shirley Temple. You can look this up online, and making the point that the way she's treated by America and Hollywood makes this very young, very pre-adolescent girl into an object of sexuality, like the mothers and fathers who parade their daughters at 5, 6, 7 with makeup and alluring looks in beauty contests. And he said it, and he was sued by the film company. There was a lawsuit that he left England to avoid. For many years, he could not write movie reviews. For many years, you could not find a copy of the article, the review that he wrote in a journal, well before the archives of internet. Now you can read the review. I don't remember how the case was settled, but it was scandalous on both sides. People who thought it's absurd that he should be pilloried for making a comment that even if you don't agree it's true, he can say. People farther on that side who said he's onto something about what's perverse about that. And people on the other side who said, look, you can attack Uncle Sam. You could not like our president. But Shirley Temple, for the love of God, man, Shirley Temple.
Okay, here's another question. Isn't a quote unquote evil person simply just a psychopath, or is there more to it?
I'm grateful that people have such respect for me that they think I'm prepared to answer such a question. That is absolutely a transliterary question, a question beyond the scope of literature. And though I may have my own opinions, I'm not invited to come here for that kind of opinion. That's a question that each of us can make up, can decide on our own. One of the great things about literature is that if it's any good, it does an adequate job or a superb job of competing with life and allows us to have the same insights or disagreements we might have about people we know. The difference is the evidence for what we want to say is static in front of us. We can actually quote the statement that Holden Caulfield makes. We can actually look at the document in a way that we can't look at our next door neighbor. But recently I was talking about the great Tolstoy novel, Anna Karenina, with one of my book groups that had done it 17 years ago. They're still with me, and we decided we would revisit it. And there was so much disagreement about Anna and Vronsky and Karenin that one of the comments I made is that it's a testament to the greatness of the novel that people were having the members of the group were having the same kinds of disagreement about these imaginary people that we would have about people that we know. People had very strong feelings in our discussion about marriage, about adultery. And if the novel were something that clearly tipped its hand about being and having an agenda or a moral or being propagandist, you couldn't have that discussion. You'd say it's clear that Tolstoy hates Anna. It shows up in everything. Well, it's not clear. He's bothered to make her rounded enough that people have disagreements the same way they might about my Aunt Mary, God rest her soul. Tolstoy is reported to have said he looked around the world and didn't see anyone quite like Anna, and so he made her. That is, he wasn't looking to reflect what he knew about the world. He was looking to augment it by creating something that it was lacking. And if you study Tolstoy or Anna Karenina, you know that he set out to write a novel in which he was going to take some literary satisfaction in Anna's fate. If you do not know the end of Anna Karenina, I apologize for telling you the outcome. even though it does not spoil the novel as a reading experience. She takes her own life by throwing herself under a commercial train, not a passenger train, part of the comment on money and finery. And there are symbolic foreshadowings of that several times throughout the novel. And he put it the epigraph to the novel, "Vengeance is mine," which the Lord said. And it seems clear that Tolstoy set out in his moralism, and he himself was a radical Christian. For many people in his day, near the end of his life, he was admired like Gandhi as much as a religious figure as a writer. And then what happened is he was too good a writer to write her off. And so he created a more complicated Anna than the adulteress he thought he was going to create. He was surprised, defeated in a way by his own success in writing her. Graham Greene thought that his novels, in their interest in the dark side of life, would be failures. And he wrote them because he felt he had to write them. And he made a boatload of money during his life. And he is reported to have said, "I'm a failure at failure."
Yeah. Okay, we got a couple of more. Is Bright, and these are literary, not transliterary. Is Brighton Rock, quote unquote, Brighton Rock, a truly inspired title, or is it a way of reminding us of a local time and color?
Yeah. So I appreciate that question. I think it's a wise question. And I think part of its wisdom is that it answers its own question. Often either or things are both. And of course, it has the character of a particular place, like Howard's End. And in Howard's End, that place, that locative sense of an actual location matters enormously in the novel. It's a scene of conflict and then a scene of resolution. If there's going to be a New England, the center of it is in this Howard's End. Virginia Woolf's last novel, Between the Acts, published after her death by suicide, takes place on the estate of a couple named Isabel, and Giles Oliver, and their home is called Pointz Hall, Pointz, Pointz Hall, the kind of place. So Brighton Rock has the advantage of being an actual place that people certainly in England in the time it came out would recognize. It also is a candy, as you know from reading the novel, so it has that advantage of the tie-in. And of course, it does have whatever implication. Michael, this question's better than my memory of it. Could you repeat the first part of that question?
Sure. Is Brighton Rock a truly inspired title, or is it a way of reminding us of a local time and color?
Yeah, so it's inspired in that we are all invited, or at least permitted, to make hay out of Brighton Rock. Again, people in its day would know Brighton as a vacation place, as a getaway, what would be Coney Island from my youth in Brooklyn. When Ferlinghetti wrote a collection of poems called Coney Island of the Mind, any New Yorker knew what he meant by Coney Island. Brighton has that feel, but of course the rock is another thing. The rock is like the wall that will not be moved. William Butler Yeats has a phenomenal poem called Easter 1916, where he talks about his own foolishness in thinking that art should have nothing to do with politics, even after finding out that many of his collaborators were rebels for the cause of a free Ireland. And he is stunned to find out that some of these men and women, it's a magnificent poem, Easter 1916, that they are going to be tried and executed for an action that he didn't think artistic people would care about, because Yeats himself did not care about it. And he has a passage in the poem where he talks about the ever-changeableness of life, that the horse's hoof does not fall into the same stream twice, for example. The old Heraclitus notion that nobody walks in the same stream twice. Everything is changing. And he says, and yet the stone is in the midst of it all. Stone is a word that appears often in Yeats's poetry. It's a good Irish word about what the Germans would call das Ding an sich, the thing itself, the stone. And he says, the stone is in the midst of it all. That is, for people who are committed to an ideal, to a cause, to a mission like Ida, the image of life as a stream, as flux, is irrelevant because they will stand their ground like that wall scrawled with graffiti. And I will tell you that many years ago, in the recent past, we acknowledged the anniversary of Tiananmen Square. You will remember the young man, not identified and feared to have been removed from the face of the earth, who was holding shopping bags and stood immobile like a stone in front of a tank that stopped and got the driver rather, to come out, raise his helmet and confront, maybe in anger, maybe in consternation, maybe in admiration. But you all know that picture, and if you don't, look it up. And I saw that at the time with my very young son, and I said to myself out loud, seeing that on TV, the stone is in the midst of it all. The first thing that came to me is that line from Yeats's Easter 1916. And my son said to me, "Daddy, what's that from?" Thinking that I was knowledgeable about about Chinese politics. And I said, "Oh, it's from a poem by Yeats." And he looked at me and he turned to his mother and said, "That is so Daddy." So that's what you get. You
That's
get
great.
Daddy tonight. And maybe we'll leave it there.
If you want, there was one more question that
Oh no, last question, please.
It's probably a good one to finish with because it lightly touches on all four of the books. Do you feel that Clarissa stands out from all the other women in the four novels you discussed? Her first name promotes that impression.
Yeah, well, I want to say yes, I agree with that. Although it's not a very challenging field to look for women in this novel or certainly in Secret Agent. It is true that Ida is a phenomenon, but she's radically different from Clarissa. I will say that as much as I admire Ida, Clarissa's distinction is she's in a book named after her, and there is much more of her consciousness. We largely know Ida from the outside in. She's that kind of person. If you were going to travel cross country, well, I'll make it about me. If I were going to travel cross country for a companion, I'm not talking about intimacy, just good old natured fun. I think you'd want Ida before Clarissa. And I don't think there's much competition. The Schlegel girls, and certainly Margaret is an extraordinary person as well. Maybe most impressive is the first Mrs. Wilcox, but she doesn't survive very long. I will say that Ida is played in the remake, the 2010 remake of this novel by Helen Mirren. And although her physique does not quite match the description, she gets some padding in the right places, and she's a remarkable incarnation of Ida. So the good thing about it, and that with respect to the questioner about, say, Clarissa versus Ida, my students, when I taught full-time in college, were very eager to hear from me what my favorite Shakespeare novel was, or what my favorite Virginia Woolf novel was. And I tell them that it's not a competition, and that a day that you catch me in the right mood, I might say my favorite Shakespeare play is Twelfth Night. And another day I might say King Lear. And the good news is it's not like Fahrenheit 451, where you have to pick one book before it's burned and memorize it so that you can be the stories of Edgar Allan Poe. Luckily, the books aren't under attack. And so you can like all of them or none of them as the mood or your particular circumstances suit. I want to say again in wrapping up, I'm forever grateful for the work that Michael and his staff do to make this seemingly easy arrangement happen. I'm grateful for his invitations and also for his collaboration. He's a joy to work with. And most especially grateful to all of you for coming and giving your attention and your comments and questions either during the session or thereafter. So I will be online, not tonight, but soon to answer questions. And it looks like I will see you sometime in the spring. I wish you all a happy Halloween and the several holidays that will come between now and the next time I see you. And let's hope that when I'm back here, either here, or there, here in the spring, the world is in a better place.
Fantastic, Mark. Thanks again for a fantastic series. Already looking forward to the next one. And as I said, folks, Mark and I have had a couple of exchanges about it. It's going to be great. We'll give you a heads up about it well before we even announce it so that you have a head start on penciling it in on your calendar. Got a couple of great comments just Mark, for you. Bravo, fantastic. Keep doing these.
Oh, I have time for those, Michael. I don't want to rush out if you want to, yeah.
And so, and we do get that kind of feedback from people directly to me. And it's great joy working with you on these. I love how these turn out. And thanks everybody for sticking with us for 4 weeks of really, really excellent lecturing and discussion. And have a good evening. And as Mark said, all the good holidays coming up, and stay in touch. We've got a poetry seminar series starting next Thursday, which will be live in person in the Brubeck Room with our friend and colleague Judson Scruton. So take a look at the library website for that. And otherwise, keep your eyes on the e-newsletter to make sure you catch the announcements of all of our programs coming up. Thanks again, everybody. Thanks again, Mark.
Thank you, Michael. Good night, all.